Hello, everyone. Marc Sabatella here with the Mastering MuseScore School. Welcome to the MuseScore Café for today, January 20th, 2021. So, we are at this sort of historic juncture for MuseScore as we're kind of wrapping up the first 10 years of its existence and get ready for the what's coming next. And so I've been doing a bunch of the cafes on that theme of kind of looking back and looking ahead. So that's kind of what I want to continue today with maybe my own personal spin on it. And as always, always happy to be answering your questions. So I'll be checking the chat over here. And uh, yeah, just feel free to be asking questions and about anything, and I'm happy to talk about. So the thing that I wanted to sort of focus on were some of things that I personally am involved with. Like you mostly know probably that I'm one of the developers of MuseScore. I was not the original developer. There was maybe a period of time where I was one of the chief developers, maybe. And, now there's enough other people that I wouldn't claim that role anymore. Certainly wouldn't claim that role anymore. But I've definitely had a very strong kind of personal relationship to a number of features in MuseScore. So I want to talk about some of those, talk about a little bit about what the impetus was for developing some of these features, and then how we went about it, and just I don't know, talk about the process of how we actually add features. It's not so much talking about the programming of it, but how we decide these things, how we decide how they're going to look, the problems we try to solve. Because to me, I made this point in the announcement that I sent out about this cafe. Um, what I would say is problem solving is problem solving. And I feel like I'm kind of wearing the same problem solving hat, whether I'm talking about problem solving in the sense of actually fixing bugs or adding features or creating music. Improvising is a problem solving activity. Composing is a problem solving activity. So yeah, I just want to talk about how all these things relate, and I'm so going to talk a little bit about my personal journey in this, and then as other questions come up, then we'll deal with them. And yeah, obviously this is a historic day for the country as well, and politics is a divisive enough subject that we'll just leave it at that and say, yeah, let's all just hope for good times ahead. So. Uh, I'm going to kind of go a little bit chronologically, but maybe skip around a little bit in talking about some of these things. And if people are curious about particular features, I'm happy to talk about them as well. But maybe as you see some of the things I'm talking about, it'll give you ideas for things that you're curious about that you didn't even know you were curious about. So I want to tell you about what my sort of first involvement with MuseScore was. And I've told versions of these stories before, and some of you have heard them, but I was looking for notation software that I could use with a blind student like 10 years ago, and MuseScore wasn't it at the time. But it was fascinating. I was like, wow, there's a pretty good notation program out there. It was not quite at version 1 when I started using it, or started looking at it anyhow. And I was looking at it and said, well, gee, this really does almost everything that I would imagine needing to do in a notation program. And I've been using Finale for a number of years. There was really one major thing that it was missing as far as I was concerned. And the thing that was missing was linked parts. MuseScore 1 did not have linked parts. And by linked parts, what I mean is if you go and create a score, and many of you have probably seen this already, you create a score for string quartet or whatever, you add some notes, and you can then now say File, Parts, and this dialog has looked different every single release of MuseScore ever, probably. But now you go and you look, and there's your violin part, right? So, and if you change a note here, hey, I think I want that, I want to add some more notes. Then you can go in your violin part, and by gosh, there's the new notes also, right? So that's what linked parts are. And I had become accustomed to them in Finale, but they weren't in Finale originally either. They were something similar was in the program I used before Finale, something called Notator for the Atari computer, which was actually the first notation program that I really used. But then Sibelius introduced them, and then Finale kind of copied that feature. And then when I first started using MuseScore, this feature didn't exist, but it was being worked on. It was being developed. And so you could already use like trial versions of, what was eventually going to become MuseScore 2. And you could, play with the feature and it was not working very well. So I was very excited by that potential. For the linked parts. And I would say that this facility works extremely well, but it really hasn't changed a whole lot from that day when I first discovered MuseScore. And my very first post to the MuseScore forum is this gushing, "Wow, I can't believe this software exists and it's free and it does all these wonderful things, and the only thing it's missing is linked parts, and I see that that's coming. This is great." That was my first post into the MuseScore world there. And really, the facility hasn't changed a lot since then. I just want to talk about some of the decisions. We've tweaked a few things about how the facility works in response to sort of user feedback on things. So, like, one question that comes up is, well, what if I put in a dynamic marking here? Uh, I'll put in just a real quiet, and then the staff below it maybe has some notes. Well, now you can see, and this is one of the other things I'll talk about is automatic placement, um, that space is added automatically so that this note doesn't crash into that dynamic. But it wasn't that way originally. And even if it doesn't crash, so like, let's get rid of that note, but I'm going to put that same note over here. All right, now this note isn't actually colliding, but somehow this dynamic, maybe you feel like it's confusing because of that high note there. And maybe you want to manually adjust it to make it more obvious that it applies to this C and not to that note. Or you want to put it right over here just to make it really obvious. So the question is, you've made a manual adjustment here. Should it apply in the part? And sometimes the answer is yes, but often the answer is no. And this is an example where the answer is no, right? This dynamic marking has no business in the part being adjusted because this violin 2 note that it was sort of interfering with isn't going to show up in the part. So hopefully when we visit the part, we'll see the dynamic is still in its original position. So that is what you would expect in this case. Now there's other cases where you might want to have an adjustment that you make in both the part and the score, and you'll wish that they were linked. But the reality is we made the call that said, well, there's enough times when you don't want them linked. It's easier to make the same adjustment twice than it is, and probably you don't even want to make it the same way twice. You might want to make a similar adjustment in the part, but chances are pretty good it wouldn't be the exact same one. Now, if it's something like you just want let me return this where it belongs originally. If you just decide that, you know what, I want my dynamics lower by default. You want all your dynamics lower, and then you're thinking, oh, I'm going to have to do it for all of them. Well, in that case, you don't do it for all of them. You do it as a style setting. You move one of them down and then hit the Set as Style button over here next to the offset. And now all the other dynamics will also be lower. So if you do things with style settings, then you can have it affect all the parts also. So anyhow, that's you downloaded 1.0. That's cool. I should do that too, except I don't think we had an app image of it, so I can't run it on my Linux Chromebook machine here. But I could have it on my Windows machine. So yeah, I mean, it was a fairly full-featured program, but that was one of the big things that was missing. So there's things like this that we're still kind of looking at how we might refine in the future. How you would control which adjustments are reflected in both the score and the parts versus which are only in the score, or whatever. This has been something that we've just sort of slowly defined. We don't have any special controls over that. We've just slowly refined it over the years to the point now where hardly anyone ever complains about it anymore, because I think we do pretty much everything the way most people want most of the time. And the few times you don't, then, if you do want that dynamic moved in both, you just move them in both, and it's okay. Whereas if they were always linked and then you wanted it to only be in one or the other, there would be no way to get that to happen without adding new controls and buttons and things. And that's what we just haven't done yet. So anyhow, this is the kind of thing that I want to talk about here. It's just talking about a few features that are really powerful features, and talk about some of these decisions that have been made in designing them, and I don't know, are still being made as we look forward. So this is something that I would expect in MuseScore 4. We will maybe try to figure out some additional controls for, because yeah, we know that it would be nice to have other controls for what gets linked and what doesn't. Another thing is you might have something in the score that you want to say, watch the conductor here, but you don't want to put that in the score. You put that in the part, but you don't want it to show up in the score. Well, we can do that pretty easily. Just mark it invisible in the score, and then it's as if it wasn't there. So, but the ability to actually have things that are in the score but not the part, or vice versa, without having to make things invisible, yeah, that's something else that I can imagine us wanting to do. We just haven't really put the time into solving that problem. So I don't want to talk too much about the problems that we haven't solved. I want to talk about some of the ones we have. So many of you may know the very first thing that I actually worked on was chord symbols. And the thing was, it used to be the case if you typed C7, flat 5, flat 9. Okay, first of all, it didn't play back, right? You all know that that's new. Fairly new. This chord symbol here, C7, I typed B5, B9, right? And the B's turn into flat signs. And that all worked, and that's fine. But if I typed C7, flat 9, flat 5, in original MuseScore, one of those two would have worked and the other one wouldn't have. And I'll be danged if I can remember which. The point is, you had to enter the chord symbol exactly the way we expected you to. And the same for minor chords. Like there's C M, there's C dash, there's CM, there's CMI, CMIN. These are all common abbreviations for minor chords. And in the original MuseScore, you had to do it the way MuseScore wanted you to do it. You could select ahead of time which way you wanted to do your chords, and we gave you like 3 choices, I think. But if the way you like to do your chords wasn't one of them, you just couldn't enter chords. They would not be recognized, meaning the flats, the B's wouldn't turn the flat signs, they wouldn't transpose, and they wouldn't have played back if playback were a thing. So the very first thing that I did in getting involved with MuseScore as a programmer was implementing what we have now, which is this system that can understand almost anything you type. So I can type C, mine, 7, flat 5, flat 5, flat 9, which is meaningless, but it's going to understand it. It's, why are there 2 flat 5s there? I don't know. But the point is, it didn't care. It just processed it. It understood it. So this is what's called a parser for people who know anything about programming. It's like reading this string of letters and trying to understand it, kind of one little group of letters and numbers at a time, and understand it. Before, it was just pattern matching. Really, it had a table. There were 200 chords that it knew. That's a lot of chords, but a lot of them are crazy combinations like C13, flat 9, no 5, or whatever. There would be all sorts of things that were there. It was just a list of chords, and if you didn't type it exactly like one of those 200 things on the list, it just didn't get recognized. And so, like I said, it wouldn't have both of those on the list. So we no longer have a list of chords. We just read the chord and try to understand it. So that is something that I had, my background was in. My computer background was in that whole process of what's called parsing, reading a string and understanding it at some level, breaking it up into the little pieces. Oh, this is a C, M-I-N. That's not Simin, it's C minor 7, and knowing that that MIN is an abbreviation that means minor and has a particular meaning as far as, oh, that means it's a chord that has these notes in it and so forth. So I'll check that in a second. So yeah, my first contribution was had to do with this parsing. And it's sort of interesting because I wrote that code almost 10 years ago, right? I said MuseScore is 10 years old as of a couple of weeks from now. And I think I wrote that code about a year later. It was about a year later that I finally decided, okay, I'm going to get involved and see if I can do something about this. And maybe it wasn't quite that long. I don't know. But that code essentially hasn't changed. I mean, I wrote that code almost 10 years ago, and it wasn't a lot of code. It didn't take a lot to do this. But that code is mostly unchanged. And what it means is any bugs that were in the code 10 years ago are still there today. And often these are bugs that were never discovered until chord playback became a thing. Now that chord playback is a thing, suddenly now we're like, oh, it used to be that this chord was never really understood correctly. It just didn't really matter. And now it might not play back exactly the way you want. It's not a huge deal, but like one of them is this. C, and then you type 0 to get the half diminished symbol. Technically, half diminished implies a seventh. You're supposed to write a 7 after it, really. You should do that if you're going to use that symbol. But if you don't, any musician would understand that, because half diminished just can't be a triad. Half of what? Half diminished means a root, a flat third, a flat fifth, and a flat seventh. That is just the meaning of half diminished. So even though technically you should have a 7 in there to say it's a 7th chord, MuseScore should have been able to figure out without the 7 to play a 7th. And we don't. And it never mattered before chord playback was there. But that's because my original parser didn't do any special casing to allow for that. So anyhow, that is the type of problem now that we are coming upon now, where we realize this code I wrote 10 years ago to try to understand chord symbols, it did a perfectly good enough job to make them display the way we wanted, but maybe there's a couple cases where we're not understanding it as fully as we thought we were from a perspective of playback. Now, the reality is most of them do absolutely play back exactly the way you would want. But yeah, there's a couple little corner cases like this guy that probably should get fixed. All right, I'm going to see some of these more recent comments here. Yeah, there's some great stuff in 3.6. And I did do a cafe about the beta version where I ran through the features, and really the features haven't changed. But okay, so let me tell you. It's not 100% settled, but very likely next week, Martin Tantacrul, the person who does those videos kind of critiquing software that we then hired and is now kind of the manager of the MuseScore project, he is hopefully going to be my special guest next week. And so he will be able to show off some of his insights into some of the new stuff in 3.6, including the font that he designed. So the idea of having a sequencer built into MuseScore is definitely high on the list of things we want to see happen for MuseScore 4. We are now looking at MuseScore 4 perhaps not being one big thing that comes out all at once, but instead rolling out kind of gradually things, and the sequencer may or may not be part of the first wave of new features to show up in MuseScore 4. Martin will, I'm sure, be happy to talk about that if you ask him. So if he's here next week, which is very likely, we're probably mostly going to focus on 3.6 and the work he's already done, and then we'll probably have him back on a little bit later to talk about stuff coming on for MuseScore 4. So So Julio, I'm not sure what you're asking about the chord symbols, but all I can tell you is, yeah, we read the chord symbol when you type it. Try to understand, try to parse it up and say, oh, minor. I know what that means. I know what notes that are, and we build this internal representation of what that chord is. And we've always done that, and we always did it so that when we export to Music XML, we export it properly. We've always had this representation of what the chords were. We just never had a way to play it before. Now we do. So for MuseScore, as of 3.4, 3.5, I forget which, that got added. Okay, so chord symbols were one of the first things, the first real thing that I got involved with. I want to talk about another one, though, that really, at that point, I sort of done that and thought, okay, now I'm done. But there were a couple things that came about a couple years later that got me back into the game and really hooked me. And I have to show you one in particular because it's kind of fun. All right, first I got to do my commercial. This cafe is brought to you by my Mastering MuseScore School, where you can find these great courses on learning MuseScore, on learning theory, on learning harmony, and the free master class that I run on Thursdays. That's a live session just like this. Lots of great stuff. So let me post this to the chat. So I've done my part here. So Julio, no, there's not a database of chords. It really is a parser that understands things uh, kind of as you type them. So it's like I know the symbols themselves, like MI, like I know that minor could be a dash, an M, an MI, or an MIN. So if you want to think of that as a database, okay, yeah, there's databases of what symbols can mean minor, of what symbols can mean major, of what symbols can mean diminished. There's like a list of these symbols. There's a list of what symbols can mean lower something, because either a dash or a B for a flat sign could mean lower that fifth. And so, yeah, we have a list of what these symbols are, but then it's just sort of reading them, comparing them against that list. Say, oh, he wants to lower the fifth. I get it now. Oh, and if you make a minor 7 with a flat 5, that's really a half diminished chord. And so we actually export that to Music XML by calling it half diminished rather than calling it minor 7 flat 5. And so all of this is done sort of programmatically. It's not just a table that we look up. That was the big thing that I actually implemented. So I want to show uh, this article. So Daniel Spreadbury is the person who is he was one of the lead designers, I should say. I don't know how much development he was still doing at the time for Sibelius when Sibelius isn't gone, but the company that developed Sibelius basically got rid of the entire team that was developing it and said, all right, we're just going to kind of just let it coast from here. And then eventually they hired some additional programmers to kind of shepherd it along. But Sibelius, its heart and soul was basically cut out from it when the company that develops it basically got rid of the entire programming team. So that programming team decided we're going to create our own notation program now. They got hired by Steinberg and they created their own program called Dorico. And so Daniel was the head of the Sibelius team, now is the head of the Dorico team. And he published, while he was developing Dorico, a whole series of blog articles getting into all this sort of nitty-gritty details of how music should be presented. In other words, how things should look. And this article here, for whatever reason, just caught me. He's talking about these ways, if you have these complicated series of chords, how the accidentals actually lay out. And he went through and compared, product A, product B, and product C. I think that was Finale, Sibelius, and I think product C was Lily Pond. MuseScore was, I believe, product D. So you have to look a little further into his comparisons to find where he talks about product D. But in any case, he really went into a lot of detail about what the rules should be, because you can see that different ones do things differently. Like for this chord here, it's natural, natural, and then back in for the sharp, and then the natural. This one is natural, natural, sharp, then back in for the natural. So is this one, right? So that they all have slightly different rules. Check out this one here. We have the natural, and then the sharp. These two sharps are the bottom sharp comes before the higher sharp, but on this one, the natural sign fits in between those two. So right, everyone has their own sort of rules for how they actually stack these things, as well as what the spacing is, how far apart these natural signs are. Well, when this article came out, the bottom line was everyone else did a reasonable job. MuseScore did terribly. Julio, what I will do is I will go point you to the source code. That is the best thing I can do because and since I am going to be talking some about programming here. I mean, not a lot, but I am talking about things relating to code. If this is where the source code is for MuseScore, and then I will show you. In fact, it could be relevant because I'm not going to want to show you the code for everything, but for people who have never seen what computer code looks like, let's just take a quick look at what some of that parsing code looks like. I don't know, this is like some random order here. That's because this is, yeah, so everything that we're looking at here is for MuseScore 4, and they've rearranged things, so I don't know where things are. So I want to look at the MuseScore 3 source code. Because now it's more like I know. So libmscore is what I want. And then I'm going to look at harmony.cpp. Actually, I believe chord list.cpp is where the parser is. So here's this configure section here is where I set what these are all the different abbreviations for major. MA or MAJ or major or T. T, if you type T, you'll get a triangle. Or if you type a caret, you'll get a triangle. T because the word T triangle starts with T, at least in English, and the caret because it's the symbol that looks the most like a triangle. So these are the things. And you can see I wrote this comment in here 12 years ago or 10 years ago. Allow this to be parameterized because I thought someday maybe there would be some system where we would allow this to be extended so you could specify your own abbreviations. So we put a comment in there that says to do, and I never did it. So the actual parsing code is this thing here that says parse, and this is what's actually going through and looking at these tokens and, oh, if it's M or if it's in that list of things that defines major, we know it's a major chord, and we do all this stuff. And if we see a 0, we treat it as half diminished, and so forth. So this is the actual code that does that parsing. And I said it was only like 100 lines of code. That was before I had to implement all this Music XML stuff. The Music XML stuff, being able to export to Music XML, made it a lot more complicated. But actually, let me just search for half diminished. So there's where I do that. That's where I do that. Somewhere we'll see that place where here's where I force minor 7 flat 5 to export as half diminished. Here's where I'm looking, and I see that if you type anything that we recognize as minor and then a 7 and then a flat 5, I actually call it half diminished from XML. So this is what computer code looks like if you haven't seen it before, and that right there is the function that parses chords. So it's actually, because of the Music XML support, a lot longer than when I originally wrote it. The original code was like, I think, literally about 100 lines, and now it's several hundred. So can you customize it? Well, if you know C++ and want to rewrite the code at all, but I would recommend coming to the forum and asking some questions there about if there's extensions you want to see to the parser. Let's talk about it, but let's talk about it offline. Talk about it on the support forum on musescore.org. So anyhow, this stacking stuff, the bottom line is that we actually did a terrible job of this. I think it was Marcus that you said that you just installed MuseScore 1. Try typing in some of these chords and take a look at what happens if you enter these accidentals there, we did just an absolutely terrible job. There's just no getting around it. So product C, product E is a popular open source the graphical user. So that's what we were. Product E was MuseScore. So any pictures that show product E. Somewhere there's like this really fancy our comparison tool. So this was product E. Yeah, I don't know if this height still works, but it used to be this really fancy thing that would show all these examples and have the pictures in there, so you could see how different programs did things. And the rules are actually quite complicated. Um, the basic rule is this thing that says, well, start on you get the top and the bottom first, and then you kind of go out from here. You say, okay, I got that sharp here, and then I'm going to go out and put this one here, and I'm going to go out some more and put this one here. In other words, you start at the top and work your way down and out like that. That is essentially the rule. But things get nastier if I have a whole combination of chords like this. You go out for a while, but at some point you recognize you can come back in, and you do that. But also there's a rule that says if two notes are an octave apart, they should their accidentals should be in the same column. So there's all sorts of kind of specialized rules for how all this stuff works, but they're a little bit subjective. And all I can say is, again, we did a terrible job, and I just took it on myself to see if I could fix it. And that was the big project that really turned me from a person who occasionally dabbled in MuseScore to fix chord symbols or whatever to being a person who now knew way more than I had any right to about the internals of MuseScore and how to do stuff in it. So it was this, trying to solve this problem of stacking of accidentals, that really got me involved. And again, it's very subjective the way these rules work, but there's certain things that are pretty well agreed on. And I just devoured this article when it came out and read over all his analysis of the different ways that the different programs did it, why they might do it away. Look at this one here. This one's going out, then coming in. This one's doing, well, they both have the two, this is bass clef, so D sharps lined up, but this one then has the natural, then the sharp. This one has the sharp, then the natural, thinking about going out. And so he talked about what the trade-offs were, what the algorithms are, and what the exceptions are, and why you might make certain choices. And I was like, yeah, I can do that, and do that. And so I just did as much of the stuff as I could within, to fit his description of how it should work. And again, that's code that basically sat there for the better part of 10 years. I would say I wrote that code maybe 7 years ago. And it was written and just sat there doing things, and yet there were certain things that weren't quite right. Like this particular case right here, where we have a C and a B kind of next to each other. This sharp sign wasn't, well, actually, I don't remember if it was this case. Maybe it was this case. Let me get rid of that sharp. It might have been this case here. Anyhow, there were certain cases like this where there were clusters of notes and ledger lines together, where we weren't correctly avoiding the ledger line. The accidental would collide with the ledger line. And so that code sat there essentially untouched for 7 years until about 2 months ago when Martin said, hey, this isn't right. And I'm like, yeah, you're right, it isn't. And I went in and fixed it. Actually, someone else went in and fixed some of this stuff, but some of the stuff he didn't really understand because my code wasn't all that understandable. So he fixed this other person fixed what he could, and then I fixed these couple last little bits of collisions where in 3.5 that accidental would have collided with that ledger line, I think. If that's not the exact case of where the problem is, then sorry if that's not the exact case. It might have been more like this. Let me see. I want to add another note to this chord. Oh, no. It might, oh, gosh, look at that. This one's still wrong. Ha! All right, even in 3.6, I still get one case wrong. Oh, well. Can't win them all. But I promise we did improve things like that, so I'll have to move that manually. Gosh darn it. Thought I covered everything. I guess that was one I didn't. So, yeah, I'm talking about the accidental, the engraving rules for how these things work, not so much how you enter them. Now, that's something else that changed over the years also, how the up and down arrows work. So, for instance, if I type C and then go up, I'm going to get a C sharp, then a D, and then a D sharp, and then an E. What happens if I hit up here? I get an F, not an E sharp. Why? Well, because, well, E sharp is barely a thing, right? But what if we are in the key of E? Or, better yet, let's be in the key of B. Now, suddenly, E sharp kind of more is a thing. I mean, that's the sharp 4. That's a legitimate note choice. So now we are going to get that. And we're going to get F double sharp. In other words, whereas in the key of C, I wouldn't get F double sharp. I'll get F sharp, and then it'll go to G. But in the key of B, F double sharp is more of a thing. So originally, we weren't as smart about things like that. Now we try to be key aware as you use the up arrow to change pitches and put in accidentals that actually make sense relative to the key. And so if you want an E sharp in the key of C, you can have one. You just have to actually use the sharp sign. So sharp E to enter E sharp. Now you may know that prior to about MuseScore 3.3, I think, you would type E, then press the sharp button, which works opposite of everything else in MuseScore, right? For everything else, you select the duration first, then the note. You select the voice first, then the note. You pick a dot, then the note, right? Accidentals were backwards from all that, so new users found that confusing. Old-timers like me are still catching up. We're not used to this, and I'm still struggling sometimes to get E sharp entered correctly. So for me, the way to do it is to hit the sharp button first, then the E. But if you forget, that's okay. You can go E, and then, oh, I forgot. I forgot it's too late, right? So what I can do is hit the up arrow, I'll get an F, but then press J. J respells the note. So it tried G double flat first. I'm like, no, that's not what I mean. Let me press J again. E sharp. That's what I meant. So that's an easy-ish way if you just have trouble remembering to hit the sharp button first. You can also use the palette accidentals, by the way. So you can see that I'm just going to be sort of all over the place in terms of what I'm talking about today. But it's all about these little detailed decisions that, we implement one way and then decide, something's not quite right about this, either because we discovered on our own or people on the forums came in and said, I really think this should be different. And then, our first reaction is, why should it be different? We like it the way it is. And then eventually there's a discussion, okay, you're right, it should be different. And then we change it. So that happens over and over again throughout MuseScore. And that accidental stacking, I forget, I didn't just stumble on that blog article. I think someone pointed me to that blog article on the forum and said, hey, you should look at this, and someone should do something about it. And for whatever reason, I did. Another one that was one of the really early things that I worked on was a special request for my wife Kari, actually, who wasn't my wife at the time, but she was a musician that I knew who had pointed something out about MuseScore 1. If you had a passage where you had tightly spaced notes like this, and you tried entering a tie between two of them like this, that tie wasn't long enough to be seen. Now, actually, in this case, we didn't need to add any extra space, so let me get rid of that one for a second. Let me make these a chord. There we go. Because for chords, the tie goes between the notes, at least how we have it. Um, the This tie would have gotten just like crammed in to that little tiny space there, and you basically could not see the tie, is what would happen if you had tightly spaced notes. Kari, among other people, said, this is a problem, and I knew it was a problem, but I didn't, wasn't going to be the one to deal with it. But at some point, again, once I started getting more involved with understanding the code, I was like, I think I can fix that. So now when you add a tie, we actually take some pains to add enough space so that you can see the tie. In fact, if you want to see what it looked like before, there's a style setting that controls how much space, or what the minimum length for a tie was. And the original was 0. So if I change the minimum tie length to 0, you can see what I mean. This is what the ties looked like in MuseScore 1 in cases like this. It was just practically invisible. It was this weird little hump of a thing. So that was one of the things also that came about from user requests, and the question came up again: how are we going to do this? And we had to do a lot of thinking about what the right thing is. Like, notice here, the tie starts and ends before. It starts after the note, ends before the note, whereas here, it actually overlaps the note. Well, we overlap for single notes, but we don't generally do it for chords, because for chords, the notes, if there was an E on top of this, well, I guess that flipped the tie below. Oh, and of course, I changed my style settings. So let me undo that business. There we go. The rules are just different for if there's chords involved, because now the ties have to stay out of the way of the other notes. You can't, if we wanted to put a tie on that C, you can't put that above the C like it was here, because if you did that, it would be sitting right on top of that E. So the rules change for how ties work depending on whether they're chords or not chords, also depending on if there's any clusters in there, and we don't get all those cases right. I wasn't smart enough or thorough enough to deal with all the cases that could go wrong. But I just wanted to fix that main one where there wasn't enough space. So that was one of the other kind of early on fixes. Okay, so I'm just going to talk about a few other things that suit my fancy, and again, feel free to ask about things you're curious about. One of the big things that happened for MuseScore 3 was automatic placement. And this, again, isn't something that I wrote. Werner, the original creator of MuseScore, he's the one who did almost all the programming of most of the stuff in MuseScore, including like the original chord symbol thing, the original accidental stacking, the original tie algorithms. It was all Werner who wrote this stuff, and it was great that he did all this stuff and provided a nice solid foundation for me to build on some of the things that I did. He's the one that did the linked parts also. So with respect to automatic placement, so automatic placement is new for MuseScore 3. When I say new, I mean that's 2 years now, right? But it used to be that if I had a note above the staff, chords would not move to avoid that note. And not just chords, but also, like here, notice it actually added space between the staves to make room for that. It used to just collide. You just have this chord symbol would just sit there, and that note would just get higher and higher, and then eventually crash into the other staff, is the way that worked in MuseScore 1 and MuseScore 2. So for MuseScore 3, automatic placement came out, and it was a fantastic thing. But if you were used to how things were before, there were a lot of things about automatic placement as it originally was implemented for MuseScore 3 that were a little bit awkward. And one of them was, let me take this down to a more reasonable place here. If you had entered this C here, this note here, I don't know, that's not a C, that is a C. And you have this C chord here, you would be able to move the chord up, but it wouldn't let you move the chord down like this. Like if I wanted to say, hey, I don't want that chord so high, I'm just going to put it over here. MuseScore 3, when it first came out, would not have let you do that. And that is because the way automatic placement works is it builds what's called a skyline. It builds like a little, it's called a skyline because it's as if you just drew a line across the top of everything here, kind of like the skyline if you imagine a city at dusk where you're only seeing a silhouette. So MuseScore internally has this drawing it builds of this skyline, and then anything as you add it, like when you add that chord symbol, it looks at the skyline and says I need to put it above that skyline, and it would not allow you to put anything into that skyline. The skyline was right above that note here, and it would put that C here and then say that's it, the skyline is now up here, there is no moving that C any lower. Well, this was not flexible enough, right? People complained, hey, now I can't make these manual adjustments I want to move. If I want to move this C minor and put it onto the staff, I couldn't do it. Well, this was one of my I would say of all the things that I have done for MuseScore, or really for anything, this is one of the things of which I am most proud, is the work that I did to make exactly what you see here possible. I'm just moving these things and it's allowing me to create that collision, and yet by default, I just pressed Control R there to return this, by the way, to the default. By default, the chord symbol is placed in a way that avoids the collision and continues to avoid the collision and moves as the note moves, right? But if for whatever reason you don't like that position and you want to move it, you can just move it and it's okay. So this required some creative thinking, is all I can say, to think about how to make that work. How to make it work so it could be placed, it could avoid the collision by default, but as you moved it, it would allow you to create a collision. But I wasn't satisfied because I could have done it just by saying, well, as soon as you move it, we'll disable automatic placement. I could have done that, but I didn't want that because I didn't want moving it to disable automatic placement because I still want it to avoid other things. So for instance, I'm trying to think of the best way to show an example of this. Even though, like in this case, I think if I move this note, yeah, notice what's happening here. As the note goes up, the chord is going up with it. So it is still, in some ways, it's not like I just moved it and it disabled automatic placement. Because if I disabled automatic placement, it would stop moving with that chord. It still moves with the chord. It just does it now in a way where, like, maybe I decide, you know what, I'm going to tuck this in like this so that it's as close as it could possibly be. I'm not saying you'd really want to do that, but if that's how you want it, then it can stay that way. Oops, except the accidentals are messing that up. So let me put it back the way it was, and this time I'll use Shift Alt down arrow, which moves down. Who knows what I just did? Not going to worry about it. In other words, that chord will move with the chord symbol moves with the note, even though you've moved it into the skyline. So the problem solving involved in that was I basically locked myself in a room for a week while I solved that problem, and that was the point, and that came out with MuseScore 3.1, I think, and that is kind of the point at which people stopped complaining about MuseScore 3. We got MuseScore 3, people would say, yeah, this is really cool and all, but it's really kind of hard. It's not as flexible. It's harder for me to make these manual adjustments I want to move. That change to how automatic placement worked. The basic facility, fantastic, but it was just not quite flexible enough. And so by designing a system in which you can move things into the skyline, move them so that they create these overlaps or whatever you want, or for that matter, like if I have some text, staff 1, but then I also have something else here like a tempo marking, and for whatever reason I want the tempo marking above tempo marking, I want the staff text above the tempo marking for some reason, you'll see it's continuing to push the tempo marking up, and that used to be just too bad. But now, well, I can move my tempo marking down. You can move things in. So it's still the case that as you move things up, other things push up because automatic placement is still there. But now I can have my staff text above the tempo marking just by moving the tempo marking back down. I move the staff text up and the tempo marking back down, and I can have things in either order. So working out the details of how to make all that work that was an enormous undertaking, and it wasn't a lot of code to make that happen. It was the thinking through of how this should work, what would feel natural. And once you find something that feels natural, you know it. It's like, now finally this feels good. Needs more counterpoint. Oh, the actual piece of music here. Yeah, this is not much of a piece of music. So we'll talk about counterpoint tomorrow in the music master class, I promise. So built in, getting the figured bass to play back. Yeah, that would be interesting, and it has come up, but there's a lot more sort of AI. This chord symbol playback isn't very smart. It just literally plays that chord. It takes the notes of that chord and plays them. It has an algorithm to spread them. It tries to center them between middle C and the octave above that. And then there's different voicings where it'll do a drop 2. It drops the second note from the top down an octave. It has a few different ways it knows to voice that chord, but they're very they're very straightforward. It doesn't do a lot of thinking about this. It's not thinking about voice leading. It's just keeping things in the same octave, which more or less gives you decent voice leading. But for figured bass to really work right, you got to be smarter than that. You would need an algorithm that's smarter than our chord symbol algorithm. Not saying it couldn't be done someday, but the few people who care about figured bass playback would not be satisfied. The people who use figured bass are doing very specific things with it, and I think as a rule they would not be satisfied with playback that was as sort of crude as the chord symbol playback is. So there's just a couple other things, and as always, if there's comments, questions, happy to answer. I just want to highlight a couple other little things that came up. One thing that I want to talk about is a command that had been requested for years and years and years and years and never got implemented because everyone assumed it would be hard. And one day, I don't know, I just had an epiphany. I'm just gonna erase everything here. I had this epiphany. So what if you entered this rhythm? Let me just enter a quarter note here. Okay, so I've entered this little bit of melody here, and then later on you decide, let's see, bum 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 bum, and you decide later, you know what? I want that to be, instead of quarter, quarter, eighth, 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 half, you want it to be half of that tempo. Eighth, eighth, 16th, 16th, right? So 2/8, 4/16, etc. You want everything to be kind of halved. We had some plugins that tried to do that, but they did a not very good job of it. And it was a commonly requested feature for years, and it just kept not happening because it seemed like it would be hard. And one day I just had this epiphany of an easy way to do it. And it's by tying it into copy and paste. So again, if you watch this cafe, you would have seen the one where I talked about when this feature was introduced. I don't know, 3.2 maybe. I forget when I did it. But the epiphany was this: when you do copy and paste, we are looking at this series of notes and durations, and we're already doing some things with those durations to change things up. Like, let me copy that, and now I'm going to enter this one beat displaced. So notice what it did here. It took these 4 beamed eighth notes here and broke the beam there because, well, that's a thing, right? That needs to happen. Or if I enter that and try to put it on the fourth beat, if I'm doing my math right, well, let's just find out if I'm doing my math right. I am doing my math right. This half note here had to get rewritten as a quarter note tied to a quarter note. So in other words, we were already, when you did copy and paste, rewriting these rhythms. We were looking at these durations and then rewriting them as we went along. I said, well, as long as we're doing that, couldn't I just divide by 2 before we rewrite it? Would that work? Just put in a divide by 2? The answer is yes. In essentially 2 lines of code, if I just come here and I say paste half duration, boom, there it is. And all it is taking the same code that was already there to paste and rewrite these durations as we were going along. It just took the exact same code that was already there, and I just added a couple lines to it that said, hey, divide that value by 2. I think I had to do that in like 3 or 4 places in the code. So I say it was like 2 lines, but it was like 2 lines I had to do 3 or 4 places. I actually going to look at that now, so we're going to look at some more code. It's in, I should know where it is because I wrote it, but the answer is I don't ever know where these things are. Is there a paste.cpp? Probably is. So somewhere in here, scale, there it is. So paste f. So here is where, somehow when this function gets called, this scale has already been set to 1/2. And here is the code where I take the length of that note and multiply it by that scale. So if the scale is 1/2, there it is. That length is now multiplied by 1/2. This, I think, is multiplying the entire duration of like the entire passage by that 1/2. And then I also apply that scale here. This is where I have to do it for tuplets because tuplets have to get handled a little differently. And so you can see me doing some scale calculation here. But it's just that one little thing. Multiply it by scale. That code was already there. All I did was add times scale. That's really all I had to do. And then here's where I do it for most things, chords and rests, notes and rests. This is where I multiply by the scale. And there's just like this handful of places where here's tremolo, right? This is where tremolo gets handled. Again, I had to factor the scale in there. But that's it. These handful of places where you see I'm multiplying by the scale, that is it. Here's where I had to do something similar to handle clefs in the middle of a measure. And so basically you could look over this and see, oh, that's it now. So it was just adding in that scale or multiplying in that scale in a handful of places. I had that sucker done in an afternoon, and it waited for years and years and years because we assumed it was hard. It just needed to be someone had to come up with a way of solving the problem easily. And so that's one of the other things that I'm proud of. This was not a lot of work to do. It just required that little revelation. Oh, by the way, someone mentions BSG, that Bernard, he actually is one of the people strongly arguing against trying to do figured bass realization because he says in order to do a good job of it, you'd need too much AI. It wouldn't be worth the trouble. Please don't waste your time doing a half-assed job. So he's actually one of the people strongly arguing against implementing it. And if it ever gets implemented, it would be sort of over his objections, I think. And it probably will happen someday. And I think once he saw the chord symbol actually get implemented, he realized, you know what, that does a better job than I would have thought. He was impressed enough with the chord symbol playback that I think maybe his objections to seeing it done for figured bass are being overcome. So question here about how many years have I been coding? Well, so my degree originally was in computer science. So back when I was in college in the 80s, I had a degree in computer science. And then I worked in that field for like 8 years. I worked for Hewlett Packard for 8 years doing programming, and I left to do music. And so I left in 96 to do music and just did music for 10 years, 2006, 2011, so 15 years where I was just doing music. I didn't write a line of code during those 15 years, at least not C++ code. Maybe I wrote I don't know, a Windows batch file or something. Um, but it was it was that chord symbol parser that was the thing that got me back into writing actual computer code and actually installing a compiler on my system and doing all this stuff that I hadn't done. So I just basically had to dust off my programming skills. But, I just had the standard. I had a bachelor's degree in computer science. I got a master's. It was like a 1 year program. So I guess 5 years of school for to learn to do that. But I'd now been working on MuseScore coding for essentially 10 years since. So 2011 was when MuseScore one came out, and I started writing code for. I wrote a plugin, I think, for something or other. In 2011, and I think all the rest of the code that I'm talking about came in 2012. Not all, like the chord symbol code came then. So a Windows code entering option alongside. So I'm not sure exactly what you mean by this, Julio. You mean like to be able to put. See, LilyPond is code, right? LilyPond has this whole text representation that it converts to notation. MuseScore doesn't have that, so there's nothing to show code wise in there exactly. Um, oh, so check this out. As far as tripling notation, so going just tripling, you can do. I'm going to take this passage here, and so this is a very sneaky little feature here that I put in there because I knew it was possibly useful. I'm trying to insert some measures here. Um, I'm going to select this passage here, copy. That triplet might be a problem. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Edit, Preferences, Shortcuts, look for Paste Special. Paste Special, I think, doesn't have a shortcut by default, but Control Alt Shift E for some reason is the shortcut. Control Alt Shift E. All right, I'm going to copy that thing, and then I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to let me just press Control Alt Shift E, and we'll see what happens. It looks like it just did a plain paste, right? But let me tell you what it really does. What it really does is it looks at the note input toolbar and says convert quarter notes into that. So if you want to triple something, what you're really saying is you want to convert quarter notes into dotted half notes. So now I'm going to come back here and type Control Shift Alt E. And it might not work because of that triplet. Yeah, so let me just do a selection that doesn't involve the triplet, because what's going to happen is by tripling this thing, it's going to cross a bar line, and that's not going to fly. But I'm just going to select that first measure, come over here. I've got my dotted half note trip selected, and now Control Shift Alt E. There it is, tripled. So that much actually worked. My quarter note became a dotted half, etc. However, you don't get too excited, because yes, you can triple things, but what you can't do is convert triplets into not triplets or vice versa. So for most real world cases where you might want to convert between, say, 4/4 and 6/8, this just isn't going to fly. At some point you're going to need to convert between triplets and regular quarter notes or eighth notes or something. So unfortunately that problem isn't solved. So yeah, and you're right that you get into all sorts of crazy more triplet situations. It's solvable. Could be a summer of code project indeed. Summer of Code's going to be different this year. I think everything having to do with COVID has caused them to reevaluate how the program works, and it's going to be a different program this year. So I can't guarantee we are going to be participating or that it's going to work anywhere near the way it has in previous years. Um, so anyhow, those were the features that I wanted to sort of talk about, and I sort of talked about a few other things, but I was talking about these things. The one other thing I wanted to talk about, okay, I know there was one other, is Roman numeral analysis, and I just want to talk about this from a problem-solving aspect also. Some of you may know that I added this feature now, where under text Roman numeral analysis, and I've defined a shortcut, Control Shift R, you can now type 15716, right? Etc. And then maybe, I don't know, 264, whatever you want it to be. I'm just typing random things. That doesn't really make a lot of sense. So let's call that, uh, because I like it to make some sense, it's now 664. And it's automatically formatting this nicely. So you might look at that and say, well, that just looks like it's chord symbols, with a little bit different to it. So the reality is yes and no. I could have done it that way, but it would have been kind of a lot of work to do that, um, to sort of rewrite the the chord symbol system to handle Roman numeral analysis. So I didn't do it that way, and the main reason I didn't do it that way, because the way I did it was at least as much work, but it was a fascinating problem, and it was this. I have to show you this one last thing. Someone came up with a font to do figured bass using a font. In other words, there's no special software support. The font itself has smarts built into it, which I didn't even know was a thing, but it is. Fonts can have all sorts of smarts built into it, so that if you just type a 6, you get a 6. But if you type a 6 and a 4, the font itself automatically stacks them. And I didn't know that was a thing, but it is. And so he designed this whole font to do figured bass that way. And I looked at that and said, wow, that is really cool. We could probably use that for Roman numeral analysis. But unfortunately, it doesn't really work for Roman numeral analysis, because Roman numeral analysis looks like figured bass in some ways, but it's different enough that this font didn't work. And I started to look to see if I could modify the font to work with figured bass, and I couldn't. So I decided, you know what, if fonts can do what he did for figured bass, which is amazingly sophisticated, complicated stuff, I'll bet I could make it work for Roman numeral analysis, which is much simpler. So I designed my own font for this. I didn't design the letters. I just took an existing open source font that actually had the letters and the numbers and the flat signs and the sharp signs, but I programmed into the font all of the smarts that are necessary so that you can have that sort of formatting. And that font, then, if you install that font, you can use it in, Microsoft Word or whatever other program you might want to use it in. Any program that can use fonts can use this font. So it's called Campagna. So here you'll see I'll put my title in Campagna font, and you'll see it just looks like a plain old Roman font. And if I type a 6, oh yeah, I get the superscripted 6 and then 6-4. But if I type a backslash before the 6, I get a full size 6. That's one of the things in this font. So this is just ordinary text. So I could say this, oh, H becomes a natural sign. So I got to type backslash H. This is a 164 chord. O and O did the same thing, so put a backslash in front of it. So you probably wouldn't use Campagna to actually type your document, but you could type your document in Word using whatever font you want, but then when you want a Roman numeral, you just switch to Campagna font just for those characters, and you can have that. So then the Roman numeral analysis feature in MuseScore is just plain text that happens to use that font. But the font is available for anyone to use. So I will just post that link in here. All right. So anyhow, those were the things that I want to talk about. Just some things that I was involved in implementing. That the whole reason we did it and how we went about doing it, I thought made for some sort of interesting story. It's interesting to me anyhow, and um, so I just figured I would talk about it. So to get the 6-4, yes, you use Campagna. So if you use Roman numeral analysis, then Campagna happens already just by entering here, add text, Roman numeral analysis, you see it happens automatically. That's because Roman numeral analysis is automatically already set to Campania as the font. By the way, Campania was chosen because, well, okay, Roman, obviously Rome. So Campania is Rome is a city in Italy. Campania is a region in Italy that happens to be the region that I hail from. I mean, I wasn't born there, but my grandmother was born in a town called Benevento in Campania region, and the Sabatella side of the family, my grandfather, his family comes from also the Campania region. So that's where the name of that font came. So it's a tribute to Roman numeral analysis, but using a font name that reflects, my own heritage as it relates to Rome. So anyhow, Campania gets selected for you by default when using the Roman numeral analysis feature. But if you want to enter chord symbols you want to enter Roman numeral analysis into plain text, then yeah, just set the text to Campania to do it. And then that also means if you install Campania from that link here, then you can use it in Word as well. So this feature was only added a year or so ago. I think it was 3.3 that I added this. So if you were using MuseScore before that or using any other program, yeah, that was pretty much your only choice. One of the reasons I did it with a font, though, is because I know people want to type 164 into text documents. And so building it into the MuseScore chord symbol facility just felt like, oh, but then you can't use it in Word documents, and people want to do that. And so I just decided I was going to develop this font. So this font has been out for, probably about a year. I could probably check the history on this somehow and see when I started the work on the font. Looks like older. Yeah, looks like the initial commit was April of 2019, so not quite 2 years ago is how long this font has been around. So yeah, just go ahead and install that font, and then you can use it anywhere you want. Okay, so gone on quite a while here, and as I said, next week I'm hoping Martin will be our guest. The only thing that would get in the way is there's just, we 3.6 has been released, but we know that anytime you release a big version, there's always bugs to fix, and so we want to have a 3.6.1 release that fixes the bugs. Meanwhile, as he was doing a lot of work getting ready for 3.6, a lot of stuff that needs to happen for MuseScore 4 kind of got pushed off, so he's been very busy, but we are going to try to get him to be a guest on the program next week to talk about 3.6 and his design work on that, and then we'll have him on again sometime in the future to talk about MuseScore 4. So anyhow, that's what I got for you today. Hope something in there sparked someone's curiosity or interest about some feature and what's involved in it. And now think about, if you ever have ideas for new features you'd like to see or improvements you'd like to see, this is the lens that we think through when we're developing these features. How could we make it actually work for the user, and how could we do it in a way that's actually implementable, that won't take years and years and years to write the code for, but could do things. So even if you don't know anything about coding, just trying to put this hat on of thinking about how could you make it fit within the realm of how other things in MuseScore work is a great thing. So if you've got ideas for features, think about them. Let us know. Come to the feature request forum on MuseScore.org and show us your ideas, and we can talk about it more. So until next time, I will let you get on with your days. Remember, tomorrow is my music masterclass, and we have a lot of fun with that too. So by all means, come join us. Let me just type. Well, if you just go back to the pinned link at the top there, where I have the school. If you click there, you'll see the link to where the music masterclass is. So yeah, and 3.6 is absolutely the best, and will remain the best until MuseScore 4 comes out. So hope everyone has a great day